everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Before we dive into today's topic, I just want to take a moment to update you on Bill C-21. If you've been with us for a while or you spend any amount of time looking up Airsoft on YouTube, you will likely have heard about this bill. But essentially, Bill C-21 is a proposed set of changes to the Canadian Criminal Code. And amongst other things, it would make airsoft guns prohibited devices. So you could carry on owning the ones you have, but buying, selling, or otherwise acquiring them would become illegal. Additionally, it might cause issues for transporting them and even potentially using them on others, as we all do during a game, so we're not really sure, but obviously, this bill is not something that we as airsofters are in favor of, and there's been a very significant, let's call it, mobilization of volunteers to lobby the federal government to amend the proposed bill to exclude airsoft in a variety of different ways, which I'm not going to really get into. But so far, our position has been well received amongst opposition parties in Canada. If the aim of the bill is to keep communities safer, then the idea of banning toy guns appears a little ridiculous. In any event, the Canadian House of Commons, which is our parliamentary body, has adjourned for the summer and will only resume work after Labor Day, which gives us a few months of reprieve from the stress of thinking about all of this stuff.
It means that we're good for this airsoft season anyway.
Yeah. However, once the House resumes its business in the fall, it will continue work on attempting to pass this and, of course, other pieces of legislation. However, there seems to be a very good chance that our government will trigger an election in the fall. So in Canada, unlike, for example, in the United States, where presidential elections happen on the same date every 4 years, in Canada, elections can be called at any point in the year for a variety of reasons, which, again, I'm not going to get into. But when this happens, Parliament is dissolved, and any bills they were working on are scrapped. So, if an election is called in the fall, and Bill C-21 hasn't been passed by then Bill C-21 will die on the paper and will have to be reintroduced should the government want to try and pass it again. The long and short of this for us is that Airsoft seems to have a stay of execution, let's call it, for the time being. But we need to continue to work very hard to lobby our government to give Airsoft a special status in the criminal code to make sure that this can't happen again. We don't know if we'll be successful, but we remain hopeful. So with that said, let's carry on with the show. So today, Pat and I wanted to talk a bit about an experience that he and I have recently had with airsoft teching. So obviously we've talked about teching in the past a lot. But what we wanted to talk about in particular is sort of the steps and the process that led to the situation that we had, so what we needed to resolve, what we did about it, and what the ultimate lessons are for us. So let's give a bit of context. I've been using my airsoft gun all season so far, and it hasn't been quite as consistent as I really wanted to. I found that setting the hop up was, not great. It might unwind itself a bit sometimes, and that was just not really where I wanted to be. My shots to shot consistency was not excellent. There's some air seal issues there, I think, with the hop up unit, I should say, that I was using perhaps. And I also had some feeding issues with certain mags. And I was like, okay, you know what? I've heard a lot about the Max CNC hop-up. It's a hop-up that Chaz on our Discord has praised a lot, and looking at it online has excellent reviews, and it's, relatively expensive. And as much as, you don't have to spend money to get a good part in Airsoft, if something is expensive, you tend to think that it's probably going to be better. And also, realistically, that it's going to be better than, the stock unit at the very least, right?
And I gotta say, the Max Hop-Up unit, when we got it, the build quality on it is fantastic.
It's an $80 Canadian part, right? It's 80 Canadian dollars. So you would expect that to be a good, nice, rock solid kind of part, right? For that kind of money.
Absolutely. But, we live in a world where, like Best Buy will sell you a HDMI cable that's gold plated for $60 that is exactly the same as the one Amazon will sell you for $10.
Yeah.
So sure. I just wanted to get it out there that, we're going to be talking about really the complications issues we had with installing this, but I don't think the part's poorly manufactured. I don't think it's at fault as such.
Definitely. So, and like Pat hinted at, we had problems with the install and want to talk a little bit about sort of why that came to happen. So, I get this max hop up. I'm very excited to put it in my gun, right? I'm thinking, okay, well, this is going to fix at least some of the consistency issues because it provide a better hop mechanism on my R hop barrel, number one. And I know that the R hop barrel itself is fine. It's a good quality barrel. It's been installed with Pat, who is competent at the very least, let's call it.
Most days, anyway.
And that means that, it should perform adequately. And I know that the performance has been okay. I've been using it for like, a year and some. But I just want to push it even a bit further. So we get it. I'm very excited to get in the gun. Like Pat mentioned, like the build quality is excellent. So there's a manual with it that is extremely thorough. All the parts are there. They're very well presented, and the thing is extremely well built, right? No question. So to give you a sense of what it is, as opposed to like a regular hop-up that has sort of the dials on the side, this is more like a rotary hop-up. So it's got the dials perpendicular to your angle of fire. And the advantage there is that it is less likely to unwind itself as a result of the action of your gun, right? Of your airsoft gun shooting. You're minimizing that. So in essence, it is a more precise hop-up mechanism. And it has a little wheel with numbers on it, so you know exactly where your hop-up is set, and you can put it exactly back where you need to if anything does happen.
And I want to note, like, I've used cheaper, lower quality versions of this equipment before. Like, I've seen badly made ones. So I've spent a lot of time being kind of dubious about this kind of hop-up because of that. I know they're standard for some gearbox types, but real ones are not necessarily great in M4s, or my experience with them has been bad, I should say. Because I can't say they're all terrible. This one seems great.
Yeah, and it also has a bunch of extra features, or it can. So the one that I bought is the Max ME Pro. So the Pro can have an LED to illuminate your BBs if you're using a tracer unit. Mine doesn't, but it has a little latch that when you push the mag into the mag well, it pushes the latch up and it allows the BBs to feed. But when you remove the mag, the latch comes down and it prevents the BBs from falling out. So it retains the BBs in the hop-up unit so you don't lose BBs when you're changing mags or whatever, which, is a feature, right? They do make a version called the Sport, which doesn't include that.
It does have sort of a slight issue of, like, when you remove the mag, there can be rounds left in the gun, which isn't normally a thing with Airsoft. But really, we should all be treating these things as though they have rounds in them all of the time anyway. So
totally,
it's as long as you're being sensible, it's not an issue.
And we found as well, like when we were testing it, when there's no mag in there and there's no BBs pushing up, past that one round that gets left in the chamber, there's no way for it to keep feeding those 4 rounds, right? Because there's no vertical pressure. So
yeah, there's no pressure pushing it up. So
it's not a huge safety issue, but it's definitely something to keep in mind, right? For absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to mention it to allow you to learn from my stupidity and not have that issue.
So this is great. So I go over to Pat's house. We're like, all right, we're going to get this put in the gun. I come over, start disassembling my gun, which I've done a lot, so no problems. And so we start going at it, right? We take it apart, read the instructions, figuring out, what are the settings that we need to put it for our hop, etc. And we put it together and we put it in the gun, and everything is fine, right? There's no issue. It goes in, it fits perfectly fine in my GNP body, like in terms of the fitment of the hop up. It's something that in the past I've had issues with. If the sides of the hop up are a little thicker, it might not fit correctly, etc. But nope, slides right in. And I'm like, great, put the gun back together. And when I do that, I'm like, all right, let's get tested. I put the mag in, and the mag will not latch into the mech box.
So I'm actually going to rewind us a second here, because I want to note our first mistake when we were working on this. Our first mistake was, yeah, man, it's Tuesday night. We can get together for an hour, drop in this hop-up unit we've never seen before, of a make we've never used before. It'll just go in instantly, no problems, whatever.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And currently I'm a teacher, so I'm off for the summer, and at time of recording, and my my life is relatively chill. I'm not gonna say we shouldn't have done it on a Tuesday night, but like certainly, I ultimately think that our expectations were a little foolish, and I kind of want to throw that out here, just in the sense of, if you're dealing with putting a new thing you've never worked with before, and it's a complicated part, and this is definitely more complicated than like I have broken out the hop-up unit and it is a bog standard, completely normal one. Assuming that it's just going to be like, oh yeah, 15 minutes work is probably unwise, and I think I should have known better.
But I think you raise a fair point. With the mindset that you approach what you're about to do says a lot about also your tolerance for things going awry, right? So in our mind, it's like, this is going to take an hour tops. Like, we're going to figure this out in half an hour, and then we're going to spend a half an hour chilling, and I'll be, on the way back home with food for supper or whatever, right? And the reality is that is not at all what occurred. And like Pat just said, well, maybe not me in this particular respect, but definitely him, someone who's worked and spent a lot of time working on airsoft guns, should have known better, and you should have told me better. But neither of us thought about it, so, I mean, it is what it is. I'm not pointing any fingers. Not that you could see them because it's an audio recording, but I'm not pointing any fingers. That's not really the intent, but it's to say it's something to consider. So, it's a fair point, Pat. And as you'll see as I describe some of the problems that we have, I don't think either of us could have foreseen them, right? And that's not because it was unfamiliar parts to us, although that is a portion of it. It's just also that it was a unique sort of set of circumstances, I think, for us, right?
And this part had come to us highly recommended by someone, and it's generally viewed as being very, very good.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we had like a ton of reasons initially to be like, oh yeah, this is going to be a pain in the ass.
Exactly. So let's come back to the first problem. So I put a mag in there, and the mag will absolutely not seat in the gun. And so like the mag catch will not latch in place. We're like, okay, what's going on? Like, this doesn't make sense. It was working fine. Like, it would latch just fine. So obviously we know the only thing that's changed is the hop up, right? So we're sort of puzzling we're sort of scratching our heads going like, okay, what's going on here?
What has occurred?
So what's the first thing that you think of when you sort of run dry on ideas, like immediately? The best thing to do, obviously, is Google, right? Because chances are we are not the first people using a max hop-up, and we're probably not the first people using a max hop-up with the kinds of parts we have in our gun. Someone has had an issue like this in the past.
And, we didn't do the pre-ordering, max hop-up known issues, because, again, they came highly recommended. Yeah. And the reviews generally that are around, that have been around for a while, like, no, this is outstanding if you want to spend $80 on hop-up unit.
And to be fair, it's a hop-up, right? In my mind, it's a hop-up. How complicated can it really be?
Yeah, and that's an entirely reasonable place to start, right?
Yeah. So we go to Google and we look it up, and lo and behold, our first result is the Max website, where in their FAQ, they have this exact problem listed. Mags will not latch in the gun. So like, okay, well...
They saw this coming, and they know their issues. It's great.
So what is it that they say? Well, they're like, if you're using a reinforced gearbox, you will need to shave off some of the reinforcement because it prevents the latch from opening all the way. And we're like, what? Look at the gearbox, look at the fitment. We're like, oh yeah, so it does. So it has an extra millimeter of aluminum that is preventing that BB holding latch, which in retrospect turned out to be way more trouble than it was worth. But it prevented it from opening all the way. And in doing so, it prevented the mag from actually seating correctly and therefore to latch in position. So we're like, okay, well, it says on the thing that we got to shave down, part of the aluminum gearbox. So that's what we're going to do in the reinforcement. And we're like, maybe we can just take off the lever. Maybe we don't need it after all. But of course, the part doesn't work without it. So you need to have it in there.
It turns out that the piece that's on the lever is also the piece that actions the switch on the mag that releases BBs from the mag.
Yeah.
So
if you don't want that lever, just get the Sport. That's the if you listen to this podcast and you just stop listening, that's basically your takeaway. You can stop listening now. If you want to hear us keep going about this, you can, please feel free. So we're like, okay, well, we need to shave it down. So we start off with the files, but we, quickly move to the Dremel because we realize that using a micrometer, we're like, okay, well, there's a lot of material to remove. Not like a lot, but more than we're going to get with a file.
I was initially like, oh, I can take this off of the file. And then I was like, oh, I need to take off a lot more material than I thought. And then I followed that up with, oh, wow, this is also significantly tougher material than I was expecting.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So And of course, if you've ever dealt with any sort of like construction work or like precision work like this, or also if you're just, use your common sense, it is much easier to remove material than it is to add it back on, which is to say that adding it back on once it's taken off is impossible. So what does this mean for us? Well, it means that we need to go slowly. We need to go step by step and remove a little bit. And is that enough? No. Okay, we need to remove a little bit more. Is that enough? No, we need to remove a little bit more.
We're trying to be as precise as possible in the amount of material we take off, because if we take off too much, it's probably going to be a pain in the butt later.
Yeah, for sure. So we're trying to be precise and remove. So there's a bit of trial and error until we get to a point where we're like, okay, yeah, this seems to work well. The mags are fitting; they lock in position. And when we shoot at the cardboard box that we have set up, the cardboard trap that we have set up in the basement, BBs are coming out. They're going into the trap. Perfect. So at this point, I'm like, great. We have a game on Saturday. Everything is good. I'm gonna set my hop up, and on Saturday when I get out there, and there's no further issues. So fast forward to at this point, well, I mean, yeah, spoiler alert. But at this point, we've spent like 3 hours working on this, and 2 of those hours were more than I was mentally prepared to spend. But, there's a game on Saturday, so I just got to get done, right? So I'll go home. I'm like, all right, well, everything is working fine, whatever. And Saturday rolls around.
Slight pain in the butt, but hey, whatevs.
Yeah, and in my mind, I'm thinking, well, that's how airsoft teching with Pat goes. Like, we shoot the shit a little bit, we get it done. It's a bit of a trial and error, but we get there eventually, and then you go home, whatever, no big deal, right? That's just how it goes. The rest of the week carries on. I think it was a Wednesday we got together. And then Saturday comes around. I prep my gear the night before. I test my gun. Everything is cycling the way that it should. I don't test fire my gun in my house because I don't have the facilities here to do that. But I dry fire it, so I know that everything is working like from a gearbox standpoint. Pack all my gear, go to the game the next morning. And so Stefan's there. I'm like, well, I got my max hop up, bud. Let's go see how it works. So we go up to this area that they have set up and put a mag in and start firing. The hop up is completely off, and the BB just basically goes and just shoots up into the stratosphere. I'm like, oh, that's not supposed to do that. The hop up is off. If anything, it should be dropping. Yeah, right?
It should be rolling out, and going 15 feet. What's going on?
Yeah. So then I take a couple more shots. And it's still going up into the stratosphere. I turn the hop up. I'm like, maybe the hop up is sort of put on backwards or something. So I spin the wheel down, and then it hops it even more, which I didn't really think was possible. I back it off a bit, and it's marginally better, but it's still way over hopping. Like, it's just not really gameable. Stefan's like, well, you're shooting into the wind. Maybe that's it. So I changed my angle, and again, it's doing the same stuff. I'm like, no, this is an issue with the hop up. There's just too much.
Stefan's an optimist.
Yeah. There's just too much hop. So I'm like, okay, well, this kind of sucks. I'm like, okay, well, this... so at this point, I'm not feeling great about this. And turns out the game was canceled because not enough people showed up, which I'm cool with. But I'm like, you know what? I'm really going to try and burn this in a little bit. I'm going to put, like 40 or 50 rounds through it and see if that fixes this hop-up issue. So I start pulling the trigger, and what starts happening is the gun starts skipping shots. I'm like, So, like, it fired 2 shots, and then nothing would come out. And then it fired 2 shots again. And I would look into the max hop up because it has a little window, and I could see that there's a gap. So the next BB wasn't picked up. I was like, okay, this sucks. Like, this is a feeding issue like I've had in the past, but something is not working here. So I'm like, this sucks. So now not only do I have a hop up issue with the overhopping, which I think, I'm like, okay, I'm relatively sure Pat and I can address that. I'm not too concerned about that. But then we also have this other issue where the gun is not cycling correctly. I'm like, okay, this is frustrating. So I had a conversation with Stefan about what, likely causes were. And as we were having this conversation, probably 10 different root causes came up in this conversation, right? Oh, well, maybe there's a problem with your nozzle alignment. Maybe it's the hop-up is slightly out of position and it's dragging back and the nozzle is releasing a bit more slowly, so it's not going back all the way and picking it up forward. Maybe the nozzle is misaligned left to right, so that's dragging and you need to realign your nozzle in the gearbox. Maybe there's an issue with the mags. Maybe the mags are not feeding as forcefully as they need to pull the tappet plate to push against the tappet plate, right? To push against the nozzle and get your round seated or whatever. So all of these things come out, and they're just spinning in my head, and I'm just getting at a point where I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna do about this, but this is driving me crazy. Like, how is it that I have an $80 part and it's not working in my gun, right? And I messaged Pat and I'm like, you know what, gun is not working. We need to get together and try and fix it. Because in my mind, I'm also thinking about how this coming weekend, we have a very big airsoft game occurring where we're going to have lots of people out. We're going to play for many, many hours. And I need my gun to be working. Like, that's not what I need to be worried about that day. Right. So I'm like, okay, this needs to get sorted.
Plus, it's sort of like, oh, we thought this was working and now it's not. And that's sort of bullshit. And they're not supposed to be, or at least we don't think they're supposed to be this finicky. So it's kind of a like, huh, all right, well, off the top of my head, I'm not sure why they're not working, but let's get together and take it apart and bang our head off with it a little bit longer.
Yeah. And I mean, luckily enough, as Pat mentioned earlier, he's a teacher. He's off for the summer. So when I said, hey, can you get together tomorrow, which works for my schedule because I'm still working, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of deal. He's like, yeah, sure, no problem. Let's get together. Let's get this sorted. So perfect. So I'm like, okay, great. So I know Pat likes to sleep in. I'm going to go for, get groceries with Suze, in the morning. I'm going to go for a run. And by the time I'm done my run, Pat should be good to go and, sufficiently degrumpified and be able to focus on a bit of frustrating tech work. And there, I approached it from the point of view of this is going to take us multiple hours to resolve. I'm mentally prepared to spend, surely not like 6 hours, but definitely 3 or 4 hours to get this sorted.
Especially, for Phil, who has, I think, more limited patience for this finicky bullshit than I do. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
It's good to come into this and not be like, oh, well, this is going to take us 20 minutes to fix, if it is in fact the kind of thing that's going to take you 2 hours.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just take a brief pause here to talk about that sort of patience that you're referring to. And I was listening to, I think, several weeks ago, it must have been an old episode, but I was listening to Jocko podcast, and he talks about frustration and how you avoid frustration. And one of the things that he does to avoid frustration is act. Right? So if you're feeling in a position where you don't know what to do, you just act. You go and you do something. The challenge with me versus Pat, and the reason that I get frustrated more quickly than he does, is that part of one of the things that frustrates people is we want to act, but we don't know what to do. We don't know what the path is in front of us for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes because it's not clear, or sometimes because we don't have the experience and we don't know what to do, or we don't have knowledge to fall back on to say, I have seen this before. What I did in the past was this, and I'm going to do that again. So Pat, being a gun tech who's worked on thousands of guns now, or if not thousands, then surely hundreds and hundreds of guns at this point, and has dealt with all kinds of different problems, has a much wider breadth of experience to fall back on when stuff becomes frustrating. When you're hitting a roadblock, you're like, okay, well, I've tried this, now I'm going to try this, now I'm going to try this, I'm going to try this.
I have a larger set of, this seems dumb options.
Yeah. Whereas for me, I have a very limited scope. So when I face a problem, I'm like, well, I've tried nothing and nothing is working, right? Like, that's it. And so that's part of that frustration too. And so part of the way that I'm sort of internalizing and dealing with this is trying to think about, what am I going to do in this situation? What is our path forward? And that's not always clear, but at least one problem at a time, right? We can figure out what we're going to do. So coming back to the story, Pat and I get together on Sunday and we take it apart and we're like, what's the issue? Well, our first most obvious thing is like, all right, you know what's happening here? That latch, we didn't file down quite enough. So it's still contacting the gearbox, and when it does that, it's pushing the hop up out of position, which is causing a whole misalignment of the system, which is causing the feeding issue. So we need to make sure that we file that down far enough that that plastic lever or anodized aluminum or whatever it was is not contacting the gearbox anymore. You can put a piece of paper underneath it. There is absolutely no friction. So that's what we did. And I say we, I mean Pat. Pat broke out the Dremel, the rotary tool, and went to town and got just enough taken off that we didn't take off any sort of excess material from the gearbox that we didn't need to, and just enough that when we held the latch completely open in position, you could still see a little bit of light right underneath the piece of anodized aluminum, and we knew at that point that it's not contacting the gearbox, so the alignment is perfect.
So we've guaranteed that is no longer the issue, right? And it is the sort of like trial and error scientific method, right? Develop hypothesis, test hypothesis.
Yeah,
Grind
absolutely.
chunk of metal off for hypothesis.
And I think most importantly here, we stick to the most obvious root cause, right? What is the root cause? Well, we know that the only thing that has changed in the gun is the hop up unit, right? So if there is a problem where the gun is not picking up every round, it's skipping shots, it is more likely to be a result of the hop up than it is of, for example, the timing chip on the sector gear exploding inside the gearbox, right? Which we have had happen in the past. But it's more likely to be the hop up, this brand new part that we just put in there, than this random, completely, obscure potential root cause, right? So you deal and you treat the symptom that is the most obvious. So we fix that and we put that in the gun. We're like, great, it's gonna work perfect. And we start shooting at the cardboard trap, and it still does the same thing. It's skipping shots. So now what?
And genuinely, we were sort of at like, the hell? Yeah, and that was definitely, I think, frustrating for both of us, just in the sense that it's like, this should have fixed the issue, though. So at this point, we're back to like, well, we have that list of hypotheticals that Phil and Stefan generated, and I can generate a comparable one. But really, none of those seem immediately likely.
Yeah.
So we go back to their website.
Yeah.
Just to check and see what else they have there. And they note that, the nozzle needs to be sort of half retracted in order for this to work in that sort of, pre-cocked position. And we're like, well, we had the gun set up to do that anyway, but we'll check and make sure it's still working.
Yeah.
And it is.
Yep. We played with the precock settings as well. Like we increased the precock timing and all this kind of stuff. That didn't fix the issue. We tried different mags, right? Also, no difference whether we were using classic Stanag mags or the EPM B mags, or same issue happening, right?
Yep. So we're filtering down our list of options, and it's like, all right, well, we have a regular hop up unit with a regular barrel, just sort of sitting there. Let's toss it in and confirm that at least that works correctly before we crack open the gearbox, because clearly something's up with the gearbox. And weirdly, we put that in and it works fine.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, well, if it works fine with a regular hop up, then it's probably not a gearbox issue. We're sort of back to the what do we do with this hop up unit?
Yeah.
And so at this point, we start Googling again, because we have the sum of all human knowledge at our fingertips. We might as well ask it some questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we come back to the issue where a few websites tell us that fitment with G&P bodies can be a pain in the ass. And we're like, well, that's what we're working with. So before we sort of like get into any sort of problem solving from that, I'm genuinely like, hey Phil, like how pissed off are you with this thing? Like, are we at a point where you're considering throwing gun parts at walls? Because if we are, we should probably stop for the day.
Mm-hmm. And so I think just before we move on, I think what's really interesting and also very frustrating, and is a reality of some airsoft teching, is they would say stuff like, oh, well, the max hop up in a GNP body requires some fitment, some tinkering with the fitment. They don't tell you what that tinkering is, though. You got to figure that out for yourself, which would have been super helpful. Like, and the max FAQ specifically told us, like, if you have a reinforced gearbox, you need to remove 1 millimeter of material from the reinforced section to make sure that the lever works, right?
And that was fantastic. That's ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if you're using this hop up, you need to use a 6.5 millimeter nub versus this 4.5 millimeter nub. You should be using a hard type maple leaf bucking type with this hop up, which incidentally I also didn't have. But in a lot of cases, people will tell you, this is the problem that I had, but this is not, I'm not going to tell people how I resolved it, because again, this is trial and error. You're not necessarily sure. Like even Stefan mentioned, sometimes you take your gun apart because it's not working, and all you do is reassemble it and it's working fine, and you don't know what the difference is, like what exactly changed when you put it apart, right? Put it back together, I should say. So at any point, to come back to the point you just made, which is at this point we're like, okay, well, we know that a regular hop up works, and we have a couple of extra regular hop ups, and we know that they work in my gun. We know that the max hop up is not working the way they need to, and we know that there's a game coming up on Saturday, and I want a working gun for that, and I would like it to be my gun. Like, I know that I could borrow Pat's gun, or I could borrow somebody else's gun on the team, and they would happily lend it to me. But I don't want to use anybody else's gun. I want to use mine, right? That's the one that I'm familiar with the most and I'm comfortable with. And if I break it, it's on me, like, that kind of stuff.
And I'm the one who's within arm's reach of increasingly frustrated Phil. So, like, some self-preservation applies, right?
Yes. So, all that being said, what is the solution that is in front of us? Well, if we have a hop up that we know works and we have one that doesn't work, and I need a working gun now, the only real solution is you take the hop up that is working and you put it in your gun, and then you're content with that, and that has to be okay. So that's what we did. So I had a spare hop up actually that was a little bit nicer than the previous hop up I was using. I had a few more O-rings on it, looked in a little bit better condition.
We had a upgraded hop up unit that neither of us remembered we had, because we haven't taken apart Phil's spare in 5 years because it just works when we need it to, and it doesn't come off the wall that often.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know if it would have worked back then. But anyways, point is, we're like, yeah, we have this spare. So we take that hop up unit, we take it apart, we put my our hop barrel in it, and then we're like, okay, well, this has a regular hop up nub, and I know that I have an R hop, so I need a flat one. So then we quickly Google, okay, how are we gonna make an R hop nub using an eraser, which is very easy to do, it turns out, and we get that done.
And that's the thing we know you can do before we are Googling it. We're aware that that's an option.
Yeah. So we put together, boom, done, right? As they say, Bob's your uncle. So everything gets put in place and reassemble the gun, and it shoots fine. So now I know I have a working gun, and the only thing I need to do is in a couple of days, I need to go out and I need to range it, and dial in my red dot a little bit and all that stuff, and I'll be good to go for the weekend.
And so one of the key things here is that this means that ultimately we've achieved our primary goal, and like Phil can let this go and be salt free about it and not need to come back and work on it tomorrow or have to worry about it in the intervening period. And like I probably would have spent the rest of yesterday evening tinkering with it after he left if it had been one of those things where like, no, this has to get done and my friend's going to be super stressed out and pissed off about it until it gets fixed, but he has to go live his life and I have free time. And it is shitty in that, we have this $80 hop up that is still on my workbench here. And that, we haven't given up fitting into his gun or maybe my gun because apparently it doesn't have issues with King Arms. So we might just try to see what happens. But I want to mention one of the things that we did notice as we were going through this and testing increasingly dubious ideas to try to get this hop up working was that because the Max hop up is a beautiful anodized orange aluminum, we could tell that it was grinding against his gearbox when the whole thing is fully locked up, like when the whole thing's mated together, because there was wear on the edges where it sits aligned with the opening of the gearbox for the nozzle. And we're like, okay, so probably there is actually a fitment issue here. It's not seating properly. And with 24 hours to think about it, I'm like, well, we know that the Lonex gearbox that we have in Phil's gun is wider than a GNP gearbox standard would be. And we did that anyway because we just like Lonex gearboxes. And in fairness, it was in a King Arms before it was in this.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not tested this. This is my current Pat's working hypothesis, is that if it's too thick for the GNP gearbox, or rather if that gearbox is thicker than the GNP body wants it to be, even by a little bit, that could explain the fitment issue we were having. But I don't have a GNP gearbox to put his parts into to check that. Even if I did, I'd probably want it to be like built and hanging around so that I could just hot swap it and see. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, the fact that what we were doing to test it was putting wear on a part that shouldn't ever see wear was a big clue for me to go, okay, this is not going to work as is. Like, there's no point in continuing with this because it's just not going to go together right.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, we're at, right? There's a point where you go, okay, nothing I can do with what I currently have is going to make this work. And stopping before you break out the power tools a second time is a good idea.
Yeah. So I think ultimately, and the reason that we're talking about this is there's a couple of realities that if you're delving into airsoft teching, you absolutely need to be aware of. And we've talked about this before, but airsoft guns are toys, right? They're a really crappy air compressor stuffed as best as possible and as cheaply as possible into the form factor that we use them for to play airsoft. And consequently, it can be challenging when you're using such a wide a range of potential upgrades to find the ones that actually will work in your gun. And just because an upgrade is the best in class, even if it is absolutely, unquestionably the best of that particular item that you can get, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will work in your setup, right? And that is as true of the max hop up as it is of any other part that you can think of. Even stuff like a BTC Spectre, which we swear by in terms of a MOSFET. There could be situations where it doesn't fit quite right in your gun and you need to modify to fit correctly for different reasons. Maybe because the gearbox that you're using is not, a King Arms gearbox. It's a JG gearbox, and for some reason the fitment is not quite right, and that's it, right? Whether it's a max hop up or whether it's a BTC, like I just said, it could be anything. So you need to be prepared for the eventuality that the part that you just bought to put inside your airsoft gun may not actually work the first time around. It may require some fiddling around. It may require some testing and learning, most importantly. And at the end of the day, you may get to a point where it does not work at all. You do not know how to make this part work in your airsoft gun. And at that point, you either need to have someone on hand who can work through it with you, or you need to be prepared to walk away. And that is a reality of airsoft teching. At some point, the situation that you're in may eclipse your knowledge. And if that's the case, then you need to be prepared to walk away from it.
And I'm comfortable saying, with all honesty, that even for an experienced gun tech, that happens. And it happens that there are situations where you're like, man, if I don't put this gun down, I'm going to throw it at the wall, right? But not every issue is resolvable also, right? We've had, I cannot remember the body, but it was in our spare bodies pile, and we were messing around with it and trying to put, I think it might have been a Spectre in. And we're like, man, there's a post here that is literally in the way.
Yeah.
And we're going, why is this here? Full stop. I mean, if you're going to put a $200 vet in your gun, then probably I would recommend you just get an upgraded gearbox shell anyway, because they're not that expensive. But it can happen that you'll crack it open and be like, oh, well, I either need to put a hole in my $200 MOSFET or I need to remove this post.
Yeah.
And do not put a hole in your $200 MOSFET.
That's certainly part of the reality of teching. The other thing is that people will tell you, and rightfully so, it's not very hard to crack open a V2 gearbox or a V3 gearbox. And that's true, right? It is not very hard to do. It's not even that hard to take it apart and put it back together correctly. It's the kind of thing that, once you get with a bit of practice, it becomes easier. But if you're the kind of person who has the tools, like the actual physical tools to take apart that gearbox, you will be able to take it apart and you will be able to put it back together without too much difficulty. The thing about it is that when you're trying to do anything with the gearbox, it then becomes extremely finicky, extremely fiddly. There's a lot of different things that go in there. And so you may find that you're looking at the gears going, why is there teeth missing on my gear? Oh, okay, well, I need to get a new set of gears, right? Oh, I'm putting in a different set of gears, but now, okay, I'm having this issue. Anytime you modify it, you need to be prepared for the eventuality that whatever modification you put in there will require some tweaking and or may not actually work the way that you want it to. And that's not to say that there aren't some existing best setups that you can mirror, right? If someone says, okay, well, I've got this Lonix body and I've got these Lonix parts, everything should work fine. And that's absolutely true. But you also need to be prepared for the eventuality that maybe it won't work exactly the way that it works for this other person because their setup is not identical to yours. If you are exactly the same setup, even if you're exactly the same setup, who knows? right? Your body may be manufactured in a different lot than the ones that this other person is talking about, and that causes issues that you're just not having.
And one of the things that we really are paying for when we buy upgraded parts for Airsoft is we're paying for stuff that's made under tighter tolerances. So if I tell you, okay, so this is how we build our guns, right? I rattle through the stuff that we've already covered a bunch. Okay, we've got this gearbox and these parts. And da, da, da. Great. I can tell you that they'll work in pretty much every King Arms body I've put them in without issues. I'm sitting here chewing over and mulling over, should we be trying a different gearbox shell in fills? And I need to order a GNP gearbox shell for that project that I was mentioning anyway, so maybe I'll just try it. And we'll have, another episode in 4 weeks where we come back and go, yeah, so this worked, and the hell. It may just be that the gearbox that we have inside Phil's gun is not actually a great fit for GNP bodies, and we didn't square that away until 6 weeks from now. If that's the case, then, you'll probably be able to hear me banging my head on the desk without the aid of our podcast. But it's also the nature of airsoft teching that'll happen, and I'm not actually going to be that pissed. It'll just be like, oh, okay, another lesson learned.
Yeah.
Because to use another example, right? Like we have a Daniel Defense rail set that we like, that a bunch of our guns have mounted on them. It doesn't work on GNP. It will not go on the GNP body I have in the other room. Literally will not. Could I tell you why? No. Well, I mean, I can tell you why. The threads are the different measurements. But, like, why are GNP's threads different from King Arms and G&Gs and TMs? I have no idea.
Yeah.
I was super annoyed to find out. But, like, there's nothing you can do about it other than go, and be mildly annoyed. And the reality is that the differences between manufacturers of airsoft guns, just like what they consider to be acceptable tolerances and like some of the choices they make for whatever reasons, mean that your best in class part may not necessarily go in what you have. That build list that I build my guns to, that's currently like, oh yeah, Pat, if you sold your gun, what would you build? Yeah, you've already got the list.
Yeah.
I know it fits into VFC guns pretty well. We've done that and had no real issues with it. So I can say I'm comfortable with that. But at this point, I probably would tell you not to try putting in a GNP gun, at least until I get another 6 weeks of time to figure some stuff out. Just so that if it does turn out that we're idiots, then, or that I'm an idiot, really, I can't say we, because this is entirely my doing. Then like, okay, well, fair enough. But yeah, and that's kind of the name of the game as well, is just trial and unfortunately error.
Yeah.
And so far, this is one of the good errors where I don't think we've broken anything, right? So some frustration, perhaps some elevated blood pressure. I know Phil definitely went and had a burger and a beer yesterday after we were done, and so did I. But there's that feeling of like, oh, at least we can come back to this, because I have worked on airsoft guns where it was like, no, you jacked this up. We got to order parts, and it's going to cost you money. I'm sorry, right?
Yeah.
And this isn't one of those situations. It's a situation where like maybe we do at some point need to order a new gearbox shell for Phil, but at least that's not super expensive. And as far as we can tell, we're going to go range it in later on some evening this week, Wednesday, I think we said. But as far as we can currently tell, it's working better than it was working before. So we're getting closer to the performance metrics that Phil wants, that this frankly is capable of and should be doing. And, we haven't broken anything irreparably, lit anything on fire, or screamed too much at the project. But it's worth noting here that like all of those things are not that unusual as experiences, right? Like, breaking stuff with Airsoft, yes, it happens. Especially if you're upgrading stuff. Getting frustrated with teching is a part of teching. Probably the most important skill I've developed as an airsoft tech has nothing to do with the fact that like you can pull the trigger and I can tell you what's wrong with your gun, and everything to do with the fact that I know that there's a point where I am going to just start wanting to throw the gun at the wall, and that despite the fact that I'm very much no, I got to get it finished today, I got to get this done, I can't leave it person. at the end of the day, the key skill is not getting it fixed right now. It's going, okay, I'm gonna ruin something if I don't take a day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good segue into really sort of the final thing that I just want to leave everybody with as a bit of a recap. If you're getting into airsoft teching, you need to understand that things are not going to work exactly the way you want them to the first time around. Maybe not even the second time around, maybe not even the third time around. And so this isn't to say that when things go wrong, it's not going to be upsetting, but you need to be prepared for for stuff to go wrong, so that if they don't, well, then you're pleasantly surprised. But if they do, it's not coming as a shocker because you were expecting it, right? It may happen that you work on a gun and you break something and have to order another part. That is a real thing that can happen. And when you tech, you need to be aware that this could happen. And again, if it doesn't, right, then so much the better. And the more you tech as well, you will understand where you should and should not be doing certain things, and that'll prevent you from breaking them. But the biggest thing here is you need to have that mindset going in. If you figure out that mindset halfway through, you're going to be a lot more frustrated than if you've done it the other way around, right?
And these need to be, oh, damn it moments, not, like throwing the gun at a wall, not having a temper tantrum, right? These are things that happen. I've had my guns break and be like, that should not have occurred.
Yeah.
Oh, well. I've had guns I built for my teammates where they're like, hey, Pat, my gun is making the powdered gears noise. And I go, it shouldn't be. Literally the last gun I worked on before we were working on Phil's this time, I literally got a bad batch of pistons where the teeth just deformed under the force of being drawn back. They're steel teeth. They're, tempered steel. It's just, yeah. These two that I ordered at the same time from the same supplier were both garbage. Oh, well. Was that frustrating as hell? Yeah, absolutely. Did I have some choice words at the time with the local air? Yeah, absolutely. But it's not a thing to be like, oh, I'm clearly bad at this, or, oh, I'm going to quit teching. I have a lot more guns under my belt that are up and running fine and work great than I do bum ones.
Totally.
Like I'm a competent airsoft tech, maybe even a really good one some days. And it's just, yeah, there's nothing you can do about that, right?
And to your point earlier, it's important to know your walk-away point too, right? You need to know when you've reached a sort of threshold of frustration that is going to ultimately do more harm to your process, to your work that you're trying to do, than it will helping you resolve the situation. If you have a deadline or what have you, that adds a lot of stress to your situation. And if you're not able to resolve the situation that you're in, resolve the issue that you have within that time frame, it's going to be problematic. So you can certainly, keep this in your back pocket. If you do have a fallback option and you have it lined up and well, if this doesn't work, then I've got this other thing I can do, that will help alleviate a lot of the stress. Because I can tell you right now, I'm not stressed out about my gun right now, even though I have this $80 quote unquote waste of money, which is not doing anything for me. I'm not worried about that because what I really want is I want a gun that works. Whether it has the performance metrics that I want is a goal that we're going to strive towards. But underneath that, I would rather have a gun that's not quite as good as what I wanted, but works every time, than no gun, because that's counterintuitive, right? That's not the point.
And it's that sort of, okay, so if the hop-up's not giving you quite the distance it should, or the MOA is not as good, well, that's annoying. In the sense of like, oh, it could be a little better, right? And I'm the sort of person, especially, so I'm like, oh, I'm working on this. I want it to be an evil thing. At the end of the day, those are trivial issues compared to if I pull the trigger twice, I get one BB. Mm-hmm. Right? Like if Phil misses shots at 200 feet, which is really what we're talking about in terms of like, oh, the hop-up's not working quite right, and it's not dialed in quite as good as we want it to be. It's like, oh, it takes me 4 shots instead of 3 to hit a guy at 150 feet. Yes, we know we can get it there and we want to get it there. But like when we play this Saturday and we're doing games in like, urban CQB for half the day, right? What's going to matter to Phil is 2 trigger pulls, 2 BBs, 2 hits.
Yeah, exactly.
And it will deliver that. Right? So we can mess around with it later.
Exactly. So arm yourself with patience. understand what your process is going to look like. Recognize that trial and error is going to be in your future as you're doing stuff. And if it's not, then great, you've been very lucky. But the reality is, you will have some testing and learning to do as you go.
Remember to caffeinate your gun tech.
Yes. And I think the final point, and we talked about this right at the start, is don't be in a rush, because this is going to take a while. If your expectation is that you're going to make this modification and it's going to work perfectly, the reality is that's an unfair expectation. It's an expectation that I myself have had in the past. But as I'm coming to learn about it, especially when we look at what I would qualify as more higher end teching, when you're getting into really finessing very specific performance that you're trying to get out of your gun, there will be a lot of trial and error, and you just need to be prepared for that and understand that that's a reality of what you're trying to accomplish.
And I think the old shooter's adage is a good piece to end on, right? Slow is smooth, smooth is quick. It applies to teching as much as it applies to shooting.
And guys, thank you so much for listening. That's all we've got for you this week. Hopefully you found this educational and helpful. Like we always say, if you want to keep this conversation going, and if you want to check out the Discord especially, there's a lot of really good gun teching advice that goes in there. People will recommend a Max Hop Up to you, and I don't harbor no hate towards them. I still think they're a great piece of kit. Just not particularly fit for my gun at this particular point, but you can get lots of gun teching recommendations on our Discord. And of course, make sure to like and subscribe on any of the content that you like, and to keep us making more for you.
And hey, if you're out there and you know the solution to this and can save me some headache, pop onto the Discord and tell me, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
Either way, though, thanks for tuning in. You guys have a great week, and we look forward to talking to you in about 7 days.
Cheers, everyone.